E3 2017 is over, but we've returned with a suitcase full of fresh, minty capture for you to enjoy. And to kick off the week after E3, we're looking at Super Mario Odyssey on the Nintendo Switch. It's fair to say that Switch is having a big year with one of the best Zelda games ever released alongside the system, a nice port of Mario Kart 8, and new games such as ARMS and Splatoon 2. But Mario Odyssey promises to cap the year off nicely. I spent 20 minutes with the game this year at E3 and played through both available demo levels. But before we jump in, keep in mind that this is still very much a work in progress, and we're hopeful that some of the minor issues in this demo will be sorted for the final game. So let's get started. The first level I played was, of course, New Donk City, and if you couldn't tell by the footage already, I was being walked through the rather complex but interesting controls by a very friendly man from Nintendo. Now, while the motion controls were suggested to us here as the primary means of interaction, the game does actually work fine entirely with buttons, which is pretty nice. Okay, so what's interesting about this first environment then, is that we finally see Nintendo tackling a busy city street. Sure, it's just one floating section of a city, mind you, but it still conveys the sensation of a very packed area. And delivering this type of bustling environment at 60 frames per second on a mobile device is a rather tall order, so it's fascinating to see how the team approached it. For one thing, drawing loads of 3D character models in the world would be a huge drain on resources, so to get around that while still conveying a busy environment, distant NPCs appear to be rendered as 2D objects. Now, I'm not 100% certain on this since I only got to play 10 minutes of the game, but as you approach the characters, they fade out and are replaced with 3D models instead, which can look a little strange at times since the 3D replacements are not always lined up with them. Beyond that, the actual 3D models in the scene are often animated at half rate, so while the game is running at 60 frames per second, some of these characters are displayed at just 30 frames per second instead. It's similar to what we saw back in Halo 5 on the Xbox One, but a little less distracting here since you're generally not interacting with them in any meaningful way. These aren't really complaints, mind you, so much as observations, and give a little insight into what it takes to reach 60 frames per second in this game. Now, the city environment itself is fairly large and generally quite nice looking. The way city streets just end can look a little jarring, but when you realize that you're platforming around a giant floating block of buildings with sections running outside the edges, it kinda works. We also see a nice 3D skybox built around the city with clouds resting just below it. It's an interesting aesthetic that differs pretty heavily from previous Mario games. It kinda recalls the original Sonic Adventure actually. Now, each building decorating the map is generally quite detailed, with lots of nice geometry, flourishes, and plenty of round edges. The texture work is also very sharp here, and it overall looks really nice. Being that this is a city, there's plenty of glass, and basic cube maps are used for reflections here. And of course, shadow maps do add to the environment as well. There is an odd thing when Mario goes behind an opaque surface, you see his shadow displayed as a sort of dithered pattern, which is interesting. Now, there are also bonus areas here in New Donk City which take place outside of the main zone, asking Mario to complete various platform challenges. These look nice as well, and are free from any of the rendering issues you see in the main city itself. Really, all in all, New Donk City does look pretty nice, but it has a few rough edges here and there. The next stage though, well, that's an entirely different story. This second level, which appears to be some sort of frozen desert of sorts, is simply gorgeous and really highlights that the game is likely based upon the work poured into Super Mario 3D World, as it shares a similar look, but pushes things a little further. For one thing, the scale of the environment is much larger as it stretches out further into the distance. The structure of the stage is a little more in line with 3D Marios of the past though, with its own unique twists. The 2D section where you make your way up the tower, for instance, is simply gorgeous, and the pixel art there does translate based on the different suits that you might wear, so if you go in with a tux, you get a tux wearing 2D Mario. Not something I got to try, but I did see it demoed. What's impressive here is the attention to detail in the lighting. While there's certainly nothing like real-time global illumination happening here, obviously Nintendo has sort of taken the idea into account. You'll notice here in this area that the walls take on a red hue based on light bouncing off the red sand, and it looks pretty good. Lighting in general is just beautifully realized here, highlighting once again the talent of Nintendo's art team. Texture work is also rich and detailed throughout the world, and the geometry in general is perfectly ample. This is clearly a huge step up from Mario's previous adventures, just in terms of scale and quality. Of course, Mario's animation is excellent throughout as well, just as you would expect, and the controls are extremely responsive too. Just running around the world feels absolutely excellent. The visual design on the whole then is certainly interesting and more varied than what we see in a typical Mario game. It's no longer just the fire, desert, and ice worlds, for instance, and the trailer shown during the Nintendo Direct highlights just how crazy the game promises to get. Okay, so this brings us to the elephant in the room, so to speak, which is resolution. Mario Odyssey is still running at just 720p. And on the surface, this is a little disappointing, but keeping in mind the size of the game and the hardware it's running on, I still feel that Nintendo is making the right choice here by prioritizing frame rate over image quality. If by the time the game is released Nintendo can boost the image quality even to just 900p, that would be great, but this is mobile hardware first and foremost, so even seeing a Mario game of this size looking this nice on such hardware is impressive in itself. So just how is the performance then? Does it really hit 60 frames per second consistently? Well, Mario Odyssey is the first exploratory Mario adventure to run at 60 frames per second. Super Mario 64 and Super Mario Sunshine, the two previous games which took this style, were both capped at 30 frames per second, and Mario games since then have been more linear, straightforward affairs in comparison, making it easier to hit the target frame rate. It's great to finally experience such an open Mario game at a high frame rate like this, and seeing this type of experience on a portable console is even more impressive. In this early build then, Mario Odyssey does actually manage to hit 60 frames per second most of the time. The frozen desert was the most impressive in this regard, with the full 10-minute demo turning in a 100% locked 60 frames per second experience without a single dip. It looks and runs like an absolute dream here and feels every bit as responsive as you would hope. This is what we envisioned for Super Mario Odyssey. Now, in the more detailed city environment of New Donk City, however, there are occasional drops here and there. It seems to be relegated primarily to asset streaming as you see here, but can occur in other spots as well. For a game that still isn't set to ship for quite some time, however, things are looking very good indeed, and we're hopeful that the final game will present a locked frame rate in all stages. And since most of the dips do appear to be related to data streaming, we're also hopeful that the GPU could eventually support a slightly higher resolution. We'll see. Ultimately though, Super Mario Odyssey is shaping up very well indeed. As a game still in development, I don't want to hammer on its weak points too hard just yet, which could absolutely change in the final build, but I hope that this gives some insight into how the game is coming together. Aiming for 60 frames per second in a game like this is an ambitious goal after all, and one that developers have often opted to skip out on this gen by going for 30 frames per second instead. I'm looking at you, Crash. As a game, Mario is shaping up to be something special then. First impressions are strange, but it does grow on you quickly, and as we saw with Breath of the Wild earlier this year, it genuinely feels like Nintendo is trying to find ways to turn Mario on his head by breaking free of traditions. Yes, it does share many elements with 3D Mario games of the past, but it has such a unique style for the series that it definitely feels like its own thing. And on top of all that, the soundtrack is also shaping up to be pretty good, which is great. We'll find out for sure though when it launches later this year. But that's all for now though. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, subscribe, and follow us on Twitter as always. And we'll have more videos on E3 games over the next week. But until then, this is John signing off.